Picture this. A man arrives in America as an infant carried off a boat by parents who had nothing. His father finds work as a busboy in Harlem, not because it was the plan, but because that was what was available to a Greek immigrant trying to keep his family alive in New York City. The son grows up in that city, learns that nothing comes without work, and while he's still a college student, he starts showing up at a small grocery store on 137th Street, learning how to take inventory, how to work with suppliers, how to understand the razor-thin margins that define food retail. Not as an intern, not as someone building a resume, as someone who understood that this was how you actually built something from nothing. At 23 years old, he opens one store on the Upper West Side. Just one. No investors lining up behind him, no government grant, no tax exemption. One store. And over the next 5 decades, through recessions and riots and pandemics and every wave of change this city threw at him, he builds that single shop into the largest independent supermarket chain in Manhattan. More than 50 stores, thousands of people on his payroll, billions of dollars constructed shelf by shelf in neighborhoods that most developers wouldn't even drive through. That is a genuine American story, the kind of story this city used to celebrate. And then one day, the city he built his life in told him they were opening a competitor, not a private competitor, not another entrepreneur betting his own money. A government store, built with public funds, paying no rent, paying no property taxes, backed by unlimited public credit, and selling groceries at prices no private owner can possibly match without going under. His response to that announcement shook the entire grocery industry in New York City, and buried inside this plan, announced to a cheering crowd on a spring afternoon, is a number that nobody in City Hall chose to volunteer. A number that changes the entire picture of what this policy actually costs and who is actually being asked to pay for it. This is that story. And it's not just a New York story. Not anymore. To understand why the private grocery world in New York erupted, you need to go back to April 13th, 2026, New York City. Zohran Mamdani, the newly elected mayor who ran as a democratic socialist, was standing before a crowd gathered to celebrate his first 100 days in office. The mood was celebratory. Mamdani is a confident speaker, someone who connects with audiences, and that day he delivered an announcement that landed like a thunderclap across the entire industry. The city of New York, he said, would open its first government-run grocery store. The location, La Marqueta, a historic food market in East Harlem built beneath the elevated tracks of the Metro North rail line. The store would be 9,000 square feet, built from the ground up, and according to Mamdani's timeline, it would open by 2029. That was the beginning. The full plan called for 5 city-run grocery stores, one in every borough, by the end of his first term. Here's how Mamdani framed the economics. The city would cover construction costs, the store would pay no rent on the property, it would pay no property taxes, and it would sell groceries at wholesale prices, meaning eggs cheaper than your corner store, bread cheaper than the Gristedes 2 blocks away, produced priced in a way that no private retailer operating under normal market conditions can sustain. Mamdani told the crowd he was looking forward to the competition. He said, and these are close to his words, may the most affordable grocery store win. Bernie Sanders made a surprise appearance to cheer the plan on. The crowd loved it. The moment looked great on camera. The total price tag announced that day, $70 million across 5 stores. For the East Harlem flagship alone, the number Mamdani presented was $30 million. Those were the numbers he chose to put in front of people. And what he didn't mention, what nobody in that room volunteered, is what this entire story is actually about. But first, you need to understand exactly who John Catsimatidis is, because the media has mostly reported on him as a billionaire complaining about competition, and that framing misses the entire point. Catsimatidis was born in the 1940s on Syros, a small island in the Aegean Sea. His family came to America when he was an infant, settling in Harlem at a time when Harlem was not a neighborhood that attracted money or opportunity. His father worked as a busboy. That was the foundation. While attending New York University, Catsimatidis started working at a small grocery store on 137th Street in Harlem, not managing it, working it, learning every corner of the business from the inside, how inventory moves, how supplier relationships work, what your margins actually look like when you strip away every assumption. By 1971, he opened his own store on the Upper West Side. He was 23 years old, and he had exactly 1 store to his name. What followed was 5 decades of work that most people in this city never think about when they walk into a grocery store and pick up a carton of milk. He built Red Apple Group into one of the most substantial private business conglomerates in New York. In 1986, he acquired Gristedes, later D'Agostino's. Today, he runs the largest independent supermarket chain in Manhattan, over 50 locations, thousands of employees drawing paychecks from an operation that started with one man learning how to run a register in Harlem. His net worth is estimated at around $4.8 billion. He did not inherit that. He did not get bailed out. There were no government grants waiting for him in 1971, no tax exemptions, no public money clearing a path. He put food on shelves in neighborhoods that investors stayed away from for decades, and he kept doing it through every economic storm this city has faced. So when Mamdani announced the city would now open taxpayer-funded grocery stores and sell food at prices the private sector cannot match, Katsamatidis did not absorb it quietly. He made his position unmistakably clear. He said he simply cannot compete with a city-run store that operates tax-free, rent-free, and backed by the public treasury. And then he said something that sent a chill through City Hall. If New York City is going socialist, Katsamatidis said, he will close, sell, franchise, or move his Gristedes locations. He also threatened to relocate his corporate headquarters out of the state entirely. That is not a small threat. Gristedes and its associated operations represent thousands of jobs, a substantial tax base, and a network of stores that serve some of the same communities Mamdani claims to want to help. And when the largest private grocer in Manhattan says publicly that the policy will force him out, that is information worth taking seriously. Donald Trump weighed in, saying he was concerned the city was going to take over Katsamatidis' stores. People can have whatever view they want about that particular endorsement, but the underlying concern being raised is something that goes well beyond political affiliation. Here is what makes the situation even more significant than one billionaire's response. Katsamatidis is not the only voice raising the alarm. Fernando Mateo, who heads United Bodegas of America, an organization representing roughly 25,000 small storefront grocery owners across New York City, called the plan a disaster. These are not billionaires. These are men and women who run family-owned bodegas in the Bronx, in East Harlem, in Brooklyn neighborhoods where foot traffic is the difference between keeping the lights on and locking the door for good. Mateo warned that the few government stores would become overcrowded, generating long lines and chaos without solving anything fundamental about food access in the city. The National Grocers Association, the trade group that represents independent grocery operators across the country, released a statement calling for antitrust enforcement rather than a taxpayer-funded competitor. Specifically, they want the Robinson-Patman Act as an existing piece of federal law that addresses price discrimination, enforced against the large national chains that have used their scale to squeeze smaller operators for years. That is a legitimate policy argument. Enforce the laws that are already on the books. Do not build a government store that competes by simply ignoring the rules everyone else has to follow. So you have a billionaire with 50 stores, you have 25,000 bodega owners, you have a national trade organization, and they are all saying the same thing. When that many different kinds of businesses, from the largest independent grocer in the city to the smallest corner store, are giving you the same warning that alignment is meaningful, it does not mean they are automatically right about everything, but it tells you the concern is not manufactured. The reason the alarm is so loud comes down to a fundamental structural problem with the plan. And you need to walk through this slowly, because the way it is usually reported misses what is actually happening. A city-run grocery store will pay zero rent on its property. The bodega across the street pays rent every single month. A city-run grocery store will pay zero property taxes to New York City. The Gristedes down the block pays property taxes every year, taxes that go directly into the city's budget. A city-run grocery store does not face the same liability exposure, the same workers' compensation burden, the same licensing and inspection costs in the same way a private business does. Every financial weight that the private sector carries as a cost of doing business, the city store simply does not have on its balance sheet. And then it turns around and uses that structural advantage to sell food at prices the private operator cannot match. That is not competition. That is not the free market. What it actually is, when you describe it plainly, is the government building a business that is designed to be impossible to compete against, and then telling the private sector to compete. It's like a race where one runner starts at the finish line and the other starts a mile back, and then someone stands at the podium and says, "May the best runner win." The private grocery business in America already operates on margins that would shock most people. The average grocery store in the United States runs on a profit margin of somewhere between 1 and 3%. 1 to 3 cents of profit on every dollar of revenue. That means every cost matters enormously. Rent matters, taxes matter, licensing fees matter, spoilage matters, labor costs matter. There is almost no cushion in this business. You run lean, you manage carefully, or you close. Now imagine you are a bodega owner in East Harlem. You have run your store for 12 years. You know your customers by name. You kept your shelves stocked through the 2008 financial crisis. You figured out how to stay open during the pandemic. Every week you pay your rent. You pay your city taxes. You pay your employees. You absorb every increase in the cost of goods that your suppliers pass on to you. Your margins are already as thin as they can get. And then the city opens a store 2 blocks from your door. That store pays no rent, no taxes. It has a $30 million construction budget funded by the public. And it sells at wholesale prices. prices that are, by design, lower than what you can offer when you are carrying all the costs they are not. How do you survive that? The honest answer is that most of those businesses do not survive it. They close. And when they close, that is not a statistic. That is the checkout clerk who has worked there for 7 years losing her job. That is the overnight stocker losing his. That is the delivery drivers, the local suppliers, the repair services, the entire downstream economy that exists because that small business exists. All of it disappears. And here is what makes that outcome especially painful. The people those bodegas were serving, the working families in East Harlem, in the Bronx, in neighborhoods across the city, do not all end up at the new city store. There will be 5 city stores for a city of 8.3 million people. 5 stores. The math on who benefits is extremely limited. But the damage to the private ecosystem that has been serving those neighborhoods for decades is potentially much broader and far harder to undo. Mamdani said he looks forward to the competition. But what he is describing is not competition. It is a taxpayer-funded displacement of the people who have been doing the city's job without any city support for generations. Now here is the number. The one that was not in Mamdani's announcement on April 13th, the one that changes the entire cost picture. La Marqueta, the specific location in East Harlem that Mamdani chose for his flagship government grocery store, was already the subject of a $25 million taxpayer-funded redevelopment commitment. That commitment was made back in 2017. It was approved by the NYC Economic Development Corporation, moved through the City Council, and allocated through the city's Neighborhood Redevelopment Fund. The plan in 2017 was specific. A playground, a dog park, outdoor seating, fresh produce vendors, a food hall environment designed to revitalize a historic market that had been sitting underutilized for years. City officials confirmed the money was committed. So what happened? 9 years passed. As recently as 2023, vendors at La Marqueta were telling reporters they had seen almost none of that money. The market remained run down. The improvements that were promised never materialized. The $25 million sat somewhere in the bureaucratic system, unspent and unaccounted for in any public-facing way. And then, in 2026, Mamdani announced the city would invest $30 million to build a government grocery store at La Marqueta, a new $30 million commitment on top of the existing $25 million that is still technically attached to that site. The NYC Economic Development Corporation confirmed something important when pressed on this. None of the $25 million from 2017 will be applied to the new grocery project. It is a separate allocation. So the total public investment in that single location, one address in East Harlem, is not $30 million. It is $55 million. $25 million that has been sitting committed to that site since 2017 and produced no visible results, plus $30 million of new money for a store that will not open until 2029 at the earliest. Stephen Zager, an adjunct professor of food studies at Columbia Business School, called the $30 million figure alone outrageous. He said you would expect the doorknobs and cash registers to be solid gold. That is not hyperbole for its own sake. It is a professional assessment grounded in what a 9,000 square foot grocery store actually costs to build in Manhattan. A normal build-out of that size done at market rate in this city runs roughly $15 million. Mamdani's proposal is double that. And if you fold in the $25 million that has been sitting allocated at that site since the Obama administration, the real number for one location is $55 million. That is what was not disclosed on announcement day. Now you have to hold that number against the city's fiscal situation because the context makes it significantly worse. New York City is currently facing a $7.3 billion budget gap across 2 fiscal years. This is not a projection or a worst-case estimate. City Comptroller Mark Levine described it as the worst fiscal challenge the city has ever seen. These are the numbers coming from inside the city's own financial oversight office. Revenue growth is running at roughly 2%. Expenditure growth is running at 4.5%. That gap compounds every year it goes unaddressed. Moody's, one of the major credit rating agencies, just revised New York City's credit outlook from stable to negative. That was the first downgrade of its kind since the pandemic. The reason cited: structural imbalance and reduced financial flexibility. The city's operating surplus, the cushion it had going into this period, collapsed by 94% in a single year. That is not a rounding error. That is a near total erosion of the fiscal buffer the city had built up. This is the environment in which the city is committing $55 million to one grocery store location that will pay no taxes, open in 2029 at the earliest, and serve a fraction of the population that needs help. And to close that $7.3 billion gap, Mamdani has proposed a 9.5% property tax increase. The largest property tax hike in New York City in a decade. Property owners, when their taxes rise, pass those costs directly to tenants through rent. A $3,000 a month apartment in a building with rising property taxes does not stay at $3,000. It becomes $3,200, $3,300 more. In a city where renters are already stretched beyond what is reasonable, where people are already doubling up in apartments and making choices between food and rent that increase lands as a genuine blow. So here is the full picture as it actually stands. The city is spending $55 million in public money on a single grocery store site. That store will pay no property taxes back into the city's budget. Meanwhile, the city is raising property taxes on everyone else to close a $7.3 billion deficit. Private grocery businesses that actually do pay property taxes, the bodegas, the Gristedes locations, the independent stores, Garcham, are being undercut by a competitor they are partly funding through their own tax payments. The credit agencies are flashing warning signs, and the grocers who can leave are threatening to leave, which would shrink the tax base further, which makes the deficit worse. That is not an affordability program. That is a fiscal spiral with an announcement attached to make it look like good news. So what are the people in charge doing with all of this information? Mamdani called the Moody's downgrade premature. He pointed to former Mayor Eric Adams as the source of the deficit problem, an argument that is not without some merit. The fiscal picture did deteriorate significantly under Adams, but it does not address what the current administration is spending right now. Mamdani's team is banking heavily on Albany, coming through with roughly $5 billion in state aid to help close the gap. That is a political bet, not a guaranteed outcome. Governor Kathy Hochul has made her own position reasonably clear. Speaking at a business breakfast hosted by Katzimatidis himself in the Hamptons, she said simply that she favors free enterprise. That is not a thundering condemnation of the grocery plan, but it does signal something about where Albany's sympathies lie when it comes to government intervention in private markets. Katzimatidis told the New York Post that these types of government grocery stores simply don't work. City Council Speaker Julie Menon rejected Mamdani's property tax hike as a non-starter before the details had even been fully debated. Comptroller Levine confirmed what the numbers already show. The city is spending more than it takes in, and the trajectory has to change. There is a harder truth inside all of this that both sides are avoiding, and it matters if you care about what actually happens to working families in East Harlem and neighborhoods like it. When a reporter from AM New York asked Katzimatidis directly about the rising grocery prices that are squeezing working families right now, not as an abstract policy problem but as a daily reality, his answer was essentially that people should deal with it. High prices are a cost of living in New York. That is the city's largest independent grocer, the man who built his career serving Harlem, the man who has positioned himself as the private sector alternative to government intervention, telling the people he claims to be protecting to simply absorb the pain. That is not an answer. It is an abdication dressed up as pragmatism. So here you have two sides of the same argument, both of which are letting working families down. Mamdani's plan spends money the city does not have on a model that has never worked sustainably in a major American city, while displacing the private sector that has been doing the job for decades. Katzimatidis calls out the hypocrisy in the plan, which is legitimate, but offers no concrete solution to the affordability problem that made the political conditions for Mamdani's plan possible in the first place. The people who go to work every day in East Harlem, who budget their grocery runs, who know to the dollar how much it costs to feed their family for a week, those people are not being served by either argument. They are being used as justification for two different sets of interests that are really arguing about power and money, not about groceries. And this particular argument is not going to stay contained to New York. That is the part of this story that matters far beyond the 5 boroughs. Atlanta opened its first municipal grocery store in 2025. Chicago has similar plans actively in development. Boston is exploring the same general model, identifying neighborhoods with limited grocery access and asking whether city-funded stores could fill the gap. The pattern that is playing out in New York, a real affordability problem, a political response that expands government into the private sector, private businesses threatened by the competition, the fiscal cost quietly transferred to taxpayers, is not unique to New York. It is a policy template that is moving from city to city, and in most of those cities the full cost accounting has not been done honestly. The reason these plans gain traction is that the underlying problem they claim to solve is real. Food deserts exist. There are neighborhoods in major American cities where fresh, affordable groceries are genuinely hard to access. That is not invented. The squeeze on working families at the grocery store is not invented either. Inflation, supply chain disruptions, the consolidation of grocery supply chains into the hands of fewer and fewer large companies, all of that has made the cost of feeding a family measurably harder over the last several years. The politics of frustration are being generated by real economic pain. But the solution being offered in New York is not actually designed to fix those structural problems. It is designed to be a visible symbol of action. 5 stores in a city of 8.3 million people does not solve food access. It does not address the pricing power of the large national chains. It does not enforce the antitrust and price discrimination laws that are already on the books and that the National Grocers Association is asking for. What it does is create a powerful image, the mayor cutting a ribbon on a government grocery store, while the actual machinery of the problem continues operating exactly as before. The people who benefit most from government grocery stores that never actually fix the system are the politicians who announce them. The people who pay the cost are the small business owners who lose their customer base, the employees who lose their jobs, the taxpayers who fund the project, and eventually the same working families the whole thing was supposed to help, because when the private ecosystem contracts, the options contract with it. Go back to where this started. A man arrives in America as an infant. His father is a busboy in Harlem. He works a grocery store on 137th Street while still in school. He opens one store at 23. He never stops building. He pays his rent. He pays his taxes. He keeps his stores open through every storm this city has faced for 50 years. And the city he built his business in is now spending $55 million in public money on a single location to undercut him, and it disclosed only $30 million of that cost when it made the announcement. Here is what that omission tells you. The people designing this policy know the full number is harder to defend. They know that $55 million for one grocery store in a city facing a $7.3 billion deficit, with a credit outlook that just went negative for the first time since the pandemic, is not a number that generates a crowd-pleasing announcement. So they gave the crowd $30 million and left the other $25 million sitting in 9-year-old budget documents that most reporters and most citizens will never find. That is the real price of the free grocery store, not just the money, the deliberate gap between what was announced and what is actually committed. The argument for this policy, made honestly, would sound something like this. Private markets have failed to deliver affordable food in certain neighborhoods. We believe the government can do it better, and we are willing to spend public money and accept the consequences to prove it. That is a defensible position that reasonable people can debate. But that is not the argument that was made. The argument that was made was that competition is good and may the most affordable store win, while building a competitor that is structurally designed to be impossible to beat. When a city raises property taxes on residents to fund a store that pays no property taxes, that is not affordability policy. That is a transfer of cost from the government to the people the government says it is trying to help. And the businesses that were actually serving those communities on their own, without grants, without tax exemptions, through 2 recessions and a pandemic, are now being told that if they cannot compete, that is just the market working. The irony is that it is not the market working. It is exactly the opposite. 5 decades ago, a young man with nothing figured out that if you put food on shelves in neighborhoods other people ignored, and you do it consistently and honestly and at a price people can afford, you can build something real. He was right. He built it. And whatever you think of John Katzimatidis, the billionaire, the political donor, the public figure, that original instinct was sound. That is how communities get served. That is how jobs get created. That is how a tax base gets built. A city government that genuinely wanted to address food affordability could have enforced the Robinson-Patman Act. It could have made it easier for small independent grocers to operate by lowering the regulatory and tax burden that makes the margins impossible. It could have funded infrastructure in food desert neighborhoods to attract private investment rather than replace it. Those paths are slower. They are harder to photograph at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. They do not generate the same crowd energy. But they also do not cost $55 million on one address. They do not threaten to push the largest independent grocer in Manhattan out of the city. They do not add to a $7.3 billion deficit while the credit agencies issue warnings. And they do not force 25,000 bodega owners to wonder how long they can keep their doors open against a competitor that never has to worry about making next month's rent. The city of New York is not in a position to absorb $55 million in undisclosed spending on a policy experiment that has a track record of failure everywhere it has been tried. And the people who are going to pay for that experiment are not the politicians who announced it on a spring afternoon to a cheering crowd. They are the families paying higher property taxes through their rent. They are the bodega workers who will lose jobs they have held for years. They are the small business owners who will close doors they spent a lifetime building. And they are the taxpayers who will eventually be asked to fund the next announcement promising to fix the problems this one created. That $55 million was not free. It never was. Somebody always pays for the free grocery store. In New York City right now, that somebody is everyone who was not standing in that crowd on April 13th.